Welcome to Military Analytics. Ukraine strikes back around Bakhmut as Wagner reaches last streets in the city. On the evening of May 9th, just half a day after a single T-34 tank rolled through Red Square during Moscow's subdued Victory Day celebrations, something unexpected happened. Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of Russia's Wagner Mercenary group, announced that units of the Russian Regular Army's 72nd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade had fled their positions southwest of Bakhmut, the destroyed city in Donetsk Oblast that has been for 9 months the site of the bloodiest battle of Russia's war against Ukraine. A few hours later, Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade confirmed Prigozhin's claims that the 72nd was in flight, reporting their own capture of Russian positions west of a key canal running adjacent to Bakhmut. A video published by the brigade on May 13th showed Ukrainian assault infantry backed by multiple tanks and armored vehicles, surging forward across pockmarked fields, facing little resistance. The next few days showed that this Ukrainian advance was not an isolated occurrence. Since then, Ukrainian forces have reportedly made significant advances not only on the southern, but also the northern flank of Bakhmut, near the villages of Kromov and Bodanivka. Here, according to geolocated footage and Russian telegram channels, Russian regular military units abandoned their positions in a similar fashion. According to the latest official information from the Ukrainian military, Ukraine has taken back more than 20 kilometers squared around the city, including positions that Russian forces have held since February. On May 18th, the 3rd Assault Brigade once again reported a successful localized breakthrough on the western outskirts of Bakhmut. Meanwhile, however, the battle inside the city continues to move in favor of Russian forces led by Wagner and Russian paratrooper units. Twilight of the battle. The never-ending battle for Bakhmut can now be understood almost as two separate battles, those on the flanks and that inside the city. Ukraine's counterattacks have pushed Russian forces back from the two main roads of life into Bakhmut, which in theory makes Ukraine's famed fortress city easier and safer to reinforce and resupply. Unfortunately for Ukraine, over 5 months since Wagner fighters first entered Bakhmut's urban area, there is barely anything left of the fortress. As of May 18th, Russia controls over 95% of Bakhmut, with the latest open-source maps showing Ukrainian forces holding on only to a handful of streets and apartment buildings on the western outskirts of the city. In almost daily updates, Prigozhin has begun to measure Wagner's daily advances in streets and square meters, testifying to the slow progress made by the much-depleted mercenary force. On May 17th, Russian sources claimed that Wagner had taken the entirety of a neighborhood dubbed the Nest, where Ukraine had allegedly concentrated a large number of defending units. The Battle of Bakhmut. By now, likely the bloodiest single military engagement of the 21st century, looks to have finally entered its twilight. As costly as the defense has been, with Ukraine reportedly suffering high casualties, the initially controversial choice of the Ukrainian command to hold the city for as long as possible seems to have paid official. According to U.S. estimates, as of early May, Russia is believed to have suffered at least 100,000 casualties over 5 months since its assault on Bakhmut gained intensity in late autumn. This rough figure amounts to half of Ukraine's own estimates of Russia's total personnel losses since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Though the roads into the city were 4 months under constant fire from Russian forces less than a kilometer away in some areas, Ukraine did manage to keep its defense of the city stable, and the fear of a disastrous encirclement proved unfounded. Intense urban fighting where almost every street and building was contested. Ukraine successfully carried out a holding operation that will likely be remembered as one of the most decisive engagements of the war. Wagner's last victory. In a battle like that for Bakhmut, for part of the attacking force to continue its relentless urban assault while just a few kilometers away, other units chaotically flee their positions, is an unusual phenomenon. In this case, though, latest developments are likely to be closely connected to the boiling feud between Prigozhin and the Russian Defense Ministry. While reporting Wagner's gains inside Bakhmut, Prigozhin consistently goes out of his way in his daily updates to mention Russian retreats on the flanks, which Wagner handed over to the ministry back in mid-April. In competition with the regular army for favor and resources from the Kremlin, Prigozhin has become increasingly desperate to portray the ministry as incompetent and even traitorous. Prigozhin's main asset is his fighting force, which has been severely attrited over months of heavy fighting, often in human wave-style front-on attacks. Things came to a head on May 5th when Prigozhin recorded an expletive-laden video blaming Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and General Staff Head Valery Gerasimov for the death of his fighters due to a lack of munitions supply. In another video message the next day, Prigozhin threatened to pull Wagner forces out of Bakhmut if his demands weren't met. A threat the mercenary boss later backed down on. Although Wagner seems to finally be on the cusp of victory in Bakhmut, it now seems likely that it could be the end for the group as a force to be reckoned with in Russia's war against Ukraine. Speaking earlier in May to the Kyiv Independent, political scientist and expert on Russian security structures, Mark Galeotti, said that Wagner, in its current state, was a shadow of what it once was. No longer able to personally recruit from Russia's prison systems, Prigozhin has ruined relations with the defense ministry upon which he relies on for ammunition and transport for his troops. With Wagner having served its purpose in taking Bakhmut and Russian forces now shifting to a more defensive posture across the front line, it looks unlikely that the Kremlin will seek to allocate Prigozhin the resources needed to go further, especially as the defense ministry and other elites continue to invest in their own private military companies. Of all the war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukraine, Wagner's brutal, lawless approach to both war and civilian life has earned the group a notorious reputation for cruelty. The imminent downfall of Wagner is thus good news not only for the Ukrainian war effort, but also for the Ukrainian people. Has the counteroffensive begun? When Ukraine first moved forward around Bakhmut, there was chatter among Russian military bloggers that this was the beginning of Ukraine's much-anticipated counteroffensive. In a tone that bordered on panic, propagandist Yevgeny Podubny wrote on Telegram on May 11 that Ukrainian forces were making major breakthroughs around Bakhmut and could soon push so far as to surround the Wagner forces inside the city in a maneuver much like the Soviet counterattack in Stalingrad. Similar claims about the Ukrainian counteroffensive already starting were also made by Prigozhin himself, eager to draw more attention to the failures of his political rivals. Here, the obvious seeming difference between a counterattack and counteroffensive must be stressed. Significant as they were pushing Russian forces back around Bakhmut for the first time in over half a year, the Ukrainian gains are no more than local counterattacks by the brigades already stationed in these sectors, exploiting Russian weakness and poor morale to regain the initiative. While Ukraine could assign more resources to Bakhmut in an attempt to build on these gains, the large-scale counteroffensive, one which will be undoubtedly spearheaded by fresh brigades and new Western equipment, has yet to begin. Sound military doctrine dictates that the main push should be accompanied by a second or third offensive elsewhere to distract Russia's defense and force Moscow to spread its troops thin. And the Bakhmut area might be part of Kiev's plans. But this part of central Donetsk Oblast, where almost every kilometer has been won and lost with massive effort and casualties on both sides, is very unlikely to present an opportunity for the kind of strategic breakthrough that will enable Ukraine to call the counteroffensive a success. Nonetheless, the disunity among Russian forces comes at a highly beneficial time for Ukraine. In the context of Kiev's counteroffensive plans, having failed to make any real progress in large-scale offensives over winter in other sectors in Donetsk Oblast, including Volodar, Lyman, and Avdiivka, the regular Russian military has itself taken heavy losses and has now proved itself vulnerable to targeted Ukrainian counterattacks. After a grim winter defined by the war's most brutal fighting so far, Ukraine's counterattacks showed that the threat of Russia surging onward from Bakhmut towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, the key hubs of Ukraine's defense of Donetsk Oblast, has now subsided. Russia's months-long offensive in the region has run out of steam, finally opening the window for Ukraine to take the initiative at a time and place of its choosing. Note from the author. Hi, this is Francis Farrell. Cheers for reading this article. I grew up on the other side of the world, but in Ukraine I have found a home unlike any other. Just like with so many of our readers, I understand that you don't have to be from near here to realize how important Ukraine's struggle is for freedom and human rights all over the world. The Kyiv Independence mission is to lead the way in continuing to bring the best homegrown English language coverage of this war, even if the rest of the world's attention starts to fade. One of the geographies of the fate of the Second World War was between Ukraine and the Belarus border. At the same time, the route between Chernihiv and Gomel cities that connected Ukraine and Belarus was the critical region. The Soviet armies marched first to Poland over this route, and then to Berlin again on the same geography. The gasoline of Russian tanks freezes and reached Moscow today. In the last century, in Eastern Europe, the same geography is preparing to play a critical role in the second most violent conflict in the early days of the war between Ukraine and Russia. Putin's tanks marched to Chernihiv via Gomel and then joined the siege of Kiev. Belarus played a very critical role at this point. The mobility of the Russian army in the Bielsk region in Belarus began to be discussed. Kiev siege was planned to be completed with Russian extraction from Belarus. However, for Putin, things did not go as he wanted. The calendar showed that 1 year has passed after the first siege of Kiev and Russia is preparing for a new siege. At this point, the importance of Belarus has reached the highest level. However, this time the Ukrainian armed forces will not allow a surprise to come from Belarus. The steps were taken very hard. The Ukrainian armed forces suddenly cut all of the critical connections between Belarus and Ukraine. At this point, if we review the connection routes and points, we will see how critical the boundary between Belarus and Ukraine is of importance. There are very important ways and bridges on the border of Ukraine and Belarus. The transition points in Pripyat past Nizhny Zari, Dniprovsky, and Swarovsky cover very critical areas. The transition of the Russian army from these points to Ukraine may bring a disaster for the Ukrainian armed forces. Likewise, in an offensive from the south of the city of Belarus, in the city of Gomel, Belarus, Ukraine will make its armed forces in a difficult situation. For this, we observe many measures taken by Ukraine armed forces. One of them was the destruction of 13 bridges between Belarus and Ukraine. At the same time, some of the transition routes were excavated and mine traps were laid at a length of 100 kilometers and about 2 kilometers to prevent the passing of tanks and armored vehicles. In other words, the Ukrainian armed forces protected him with the necessary defense areas in the face of a Russian attack from Belarus. The most sensational move from the Ukrainian armed forces was the undisputed Belarus connecting bridges. The latest reports stated that the Ukrainian army collectively blown bridges on the border of Belarus on the ground of a new Russian attack expected by Western countries and Ukraine, including Belarus. It was learned that the Ukrainian troops began to undermine the bridges and crossings on the border of Belarus, and thus the soldiers aimed to eliminate the risk of rapid excretion. If the attack will really take place, the Ukrainians will see the benefit of these explosions in the first presented video frames. You can see how Ukraine undermines a small gate on the Belarus border with a union of the 120th Regional Defense Brigade. This is far from a single case that underlines the bridges and transitions that deliberately destroy the possible ways in which Ukrainian armed forces can be carried. It is noteworthy that even small transitions can make it difficult to carry. Military equipment is attracted attention. Residents of Slavutic estimate that Putin's forces may have planned a new attack from Belarus. However, it is stated that not only the Ukrainian armed forces, but the brave Ukrainians, are prepared for these attacks. The border cities were already besieged, but the brave inhabitants of Slavutic Russian invaders swore not to evacuate their homes as they gathered again in Belarus. The Kiev forces blew up the bridge and tied Belarus and Ukraine in the Slavutic region. It was one of the 13 transition points to Belarus. In recent weeks, Ukraine and Belarus have organized military exercises on a 674-mile border with the expectation of a new conflict. The Ukrainian army is doing exercises near the country's border with Belarus, which aims to prepare for the preparation of defense against the repetition of this cross-border land occupation. These exercises on the northern front follow the warnings that the Kremlin is planning a new attack this spring. One of the Ukrainian commanders in one of the labyrinths created by Ukraine in the region said that their troops were completely ready and with a sarcastic smile. They have prepared many gifts for any occupying power that could try to cross the border again. The commander, Kent, a call sign, did not give details about these gifts. However, unlike 12 months ago, Ukraine has made it clear that it was a strengthened limit that could prevent the heavy equipment and even light armor. The trenches seem to have jumped from the First World War, but there is modern technology at the end of the fingers of the soldiers who were preparing for war. A few Ukrainian unions are currently scattered to the 650-mile border with Belarus, but they have not yet identified any new mass mobilization of the Russian forces in the neighboring country. US officials are watching what Russian troops and equipment have entered and out of Belarus regularly, but there is no sign of a new accumulation. In any case, the Ukrainians are determined not to hunt official. It is observed that Ukrainian soldiers followed the border movements along the border. Reconnaissance, unmanned aerial vehicles fly several times a day from the Ukrainian positions in the depths of the frequent forest on both sides of the border with a close Russian ally and scanning the sky and the soil on the other side to find problems. This time, Ukrainians did not take risks. They have been strengthening the defenses since the summer. They build and expand trenches into the forest before the spring offensive, which the military officials wait for, and launch mines into the forest. The inhabitants of the villages, which were temporarily occupied in the region last year, are horrified in the face of the possibility that everything will start again. However, in the east of Ukraine, conflicts are intensified. Bakhmut, the industrial city on the front, was the focus of most of the worst conflicts this year. The city, which once hosted approximately 70,000 people, was almost completely destroyed, and now almost all of them is under Russia's control. The Ukrainian armed forces continue to punish the Russian army, even if a planned retreat in Bakhmut. However, for Ukrainians, protecting the north is now a much more priority issue. Even if we have mentioned the inactivity in Belarus, the Russian army has a serious mobility and prepares a basis for making an operation through Moscow, Belarus. The attack on Gomel airport is the biggest indicator of this. While the Allies were preparing to organize joint military exercises, Moscow warned of a collective response to any attack on Russia or Belarus. A Russian foreign ministry official said that if Kiev decided to occupy Belarus or Russia, Belarus could enter the Ukrainian dispute. Alexei Polishchuk said in an interview with the state media that Russia's military exercises with Belarus were designed to prevent climbing. However, he warned that Moscow's nearest ally had the potential to participate in the war. Belarus supported Russia on the occupation of Ukraine, but has repeatedly rejected to participate in the conflict. According to Kiev, Russia continues to use the Belarus airspace for drone and missile attacks. Last month, Belarus said that Minsk had dropped a Ukraine's S-300 air defense missile in an area called Ukraine's ambassador in the country. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense said it would investigate the incident and claimed that it could be a Russian provocation in one of the largest waves of attacks since the beginning of the conflict. The missile had fallen into the cities in Ukraine. Russia, Belarus will play a strategic role in Putin's last move. Lukashenko stubbornly states that he will not go into war with Russia right now. However, he may not be able to oppose Putin's pressure. The Ukrainian armed forces have to take into account every possibility. For this reason, which is expected to begin at the end of February, seems to have been postponed by the Kremlin because of the preparations of Ukraine. But sooner or later, Putin will play the last trump card. This last game seems to be the last nail of his destruction. Russian citizens settled in the Crimean Peninsula by Russian leader Vladimir Putin are leaving the Crimean territory as a result of the Ukrainian army's airstrikes on the Crimean Peninsula. Russian citizens living in this region have started to leave Crimea. Nearly 200,000 Russian citizens who believe that Vladimir Putin is unable to ensure Russia's security have started to leave Crimea in droves since the beginning of the Russian military occupation of Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula has become a major military base for the Russian army. Most of the ammunition and weapons sent to Russian troops in Ukraine are smuggled into Ukraine through Crimea and distributed to Russian headquarters from there. In addition, thanks to the military air bases in Crimea, Putin has carried out numerous airstrikes on Ukrainian territory, putting the Ukrainian army in a very difficult situation. Aware of this, the Ukrainian government organized a large-scale operation to locate and destroy Putin's military bases and ammunition depots on the Crimean Peninsula. The Ukrainian forces, which destroyed one of the largest air bases of the Russian army with unmanned fighter jets, managed to deal a major blow to Putin, taking action with 8 Bayraktar unmanned fighter jets. Ukrainian forces heavily damaged 152 combat helicopter and 3 Su-27 fighter jets of the Russian Air Force. Shortly after this operation, Ukrainian authorities contacted pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations operating in Crimea and planned a major act of sabotage. These resistance organizations, which have been operating in Crimea since the beginning of the war, have managed to inflict considerable damage on Russia. The Ukrainian intelligence service located one of the Russian army's ammunition depots in Simferopol. Thus, in cooperation with pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations, an operation was launched to destroy this ammunition depot. Ukrainian resistance organizations formed a team of 18 resistance fighters. This team mobilized late at night and made great preparations to blow up the Russian ammunition depot. The insurgents managed to sneak into the ammunition depot guarded by Russian soldiers and placed the plastic explosives they had in their possession in the ammunition depot. After placing these timed explosives, the insurgents quickly left the area and waited for the explosives to be activated. After minutes of fighting, there was a huge explosion and the ammunition depot started to catch fire. After this latest incident in Crimea, Russian citizens living in this region started to leave Crimea urgently. It is well known that Russian leader Vladimir Putin settled a large number of Russian citizens in Crimea when he occupied the territory in 2040 due to the large number of minority citizens living in the Crimea. Vladimir Putin sold these minority citizens as a threat to him as part of the assimilation policy that the Russian government has been pursuing for years. Russian citizens were settled in Crimea in order to control the minority citizens there. However, the recent explosions and fires on the Crimean Peninsula have exhausted the patience of the Russian citizens in Crimea as the Ukrainian army's operations against Crimea increased. Russian citizens living in Crimea started to think that Vladimir Putin does not care about his people in Crimea after these events. Thousands of Russian citizens gathered in major cities such as Sevastopol in the early hours of the day and started organizing protests against Putin and the war. The people protesting against Vladimir Putin demanded an end to the war and the return of peace. However, the most remarkable event in Crimea was the traffic on the Kerch Bridge. Hundreds of vehicles were queuing on the Kerch Bridge trying to leave the island. Russian soldiers were stationed at the end of the Kerch Bridge to prevent Russian citizens from leaving the island. For this reason, many Russian citizens tried to leave Crimea by sea. The number of Russian citizens who rented boats and tried to leave Crimea by sea was in the tens of thousands. In order to prevent Russian citizens from fleeing Crimea, Putin declared a red alert and activated the Russian National Guard called Rosgvardia. A large number of Russian National Guardsmen set foot on Crimea and soil and tried to suppress the uprising. Russian citizens, even though the Russian National Guard managed to prevent these protests by intervening harshly against their own people, they could not prevent Russian citizens from leaving Crimea. The recent explosions and fires in Russia and Crimea have increased the anger of Russian citizens against Putin. For this reason, many anti-Putin and anti-war protests are being organized across Russia. One of the things Vladimir Putin fears most is that his own people will turn against him. To prevent this from happening, Putin does not want his own people to know about the war in Ukraine. For this reason, he has banned any anti-war and anti-Russian military news in Russian television channels and newspapers. As it is known, Vladimir Putin had previously arrested a news reporter who took anti-war action on live TV. However, there were still television channels in Russia that tried to report independently in order to prevent these channels from reporting. Putin fined them under various pretexts. The channels that could not afford to pay these fines were soon shut down. Russian opposition officials who want to use Vladimir Putin's aggressive policy in Ukraine as an opportunity to oust him from his throne have also taken action against Putin. Many Russian opposition officials have started to organize speeches in many Russian cities. Opposition officials who are trying to get the support of Russian citizens think that Putin will lose the election with this war, according to the surveys conducted by independent polling companies in Russia. It is seen that Vladimir Putin's vote loss is over 15%, so it seems unlikely that Vladimir Putin will be re-elected president in the next Russian elections. There are main reasons why Vladimir Putin is so hated by his own people. But the most important one is Putin's forced recruitment of his own citizens into the Russian army. As it is known, more than 300,000 Russian citizens were conscripted into the army through partial mobilization and sent to fight in Ukraine. This is exactly why the Russian army has suffered so many casualties in Ukraine. These soldiers are sent immediately after a very short period of training, but this training is extremely inadequate. These soldiers, who have no experience of war, can lose their lives in a short time on Ukrainian soil. Many experts, researchers had warned Vladimir Putin about this, saying that these soldiers are inexperienced and do not have any knowledge about war will lead to their death very easily. Experts, researchers did not want these soldiers to be sent to Ukraine. However, despite these warnings, Vladimir Putin chose to send these soldiers to accelerate his invasion of Ukraine. Before the start of the war, Russia leader Vladimir Putin and Kremlin officials promised that the occupation of Ukraine would be completed in as little as a week and that Russian soldiers would not be harmed in any way. But now we can see that the Russian army's losses on Ukrainian territory are over 200,000. At the same time, the Russian army, which has lost a large number of armored vehicles, tanks, ammunition, and weapons, is going through a very difficult period. The Ukrainian army has managed to recapture many regions on the Russian occupation and added Russian equipment to their own inventory. As it is known, many tanks and armored vehicles belonging to the Russian army were exhibited on the streets of Kiev in recent months. The Ukrainian army is repairing the intact vehicles such as tanks and armored vehicles captured from Russian forces, adding them to their own inventory and using them against the Russian army. Previously, Ukrainian officials had made a joking statement about this issue in order to draw attention to the equipment captured from the Russian army. The Ukrainian government made a joking statement that Russia ranks first among the countries that have helped the Ukrainian army so far.